Hi, today I will read you a story about Paula, which is called that. I told my family that we needed to downsize our lifestyle if they wanted me to pay their mortgage. Then I came home to find that the locks had been changed and my bags had been thrown out on the street. Think about your behavior, they told me. I thought about it and decided to do it. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy. So, at 28, I was living my best life. And, as trite as it may sound, each new day began with a quiet gratitude for freedom, for the feeling of control over my own destiny, for the morning light streaming through the translucent curtains of my cozy apartment in the very center of the city, where everything, from the tiles in the kitchen to the decorative pillows on the sofa, was selected according to my taste and reminded me that this space belongs to me, and only me. My name is Paula, and to be honest, I was doing pretty well back then, at least from the outside. I had a decent job in a large company, not a stellar position, but stable and respected, which, coupled with a regular salary and an annual bonus, allowed me not only to make ends meet, but to feel confident and even make plans for the future, which no longer seemed like a blurry spot on the horizon, as it did in my youth. I was making good money, enough to rent a nice little apartment downtown, not a luxury apartment, of course, but spacious, bright, with high ceilings and character, and still have money left over for the necessities of life, and even for those little pleasures that make life sweeter. A cup of cappuccino in the morning from the coffee shop on the corner, going to the movies on Fridays, buying new clothes on sale, and, of course, a monthly transfer to a special savings account I had set up for the sole purpose of saving up for a down payment on my own place, so that one day I could stop paying rent and start investing in something that would truly be mine. You know how it is. At some point, you get tired of the constant sense of temporariness, of the feeling that everything around you could disappear at any moment, if only the landlord decided to raise the rent or sell the apartment. That's why I transferred everything I could to the account every month, even though these weren't huge amounts, but they grew, and this grew in me the feeling that I was moving forward, that I was building something real. It was amazing to watch these numbers grow, how the dream became a little closer, a little more real. My apartment was not huge, but it was my fortress, my corner of the world to which I could return in the evening, pull off my tight office shoes, put on warm socks and order Thai noodles from my favorite restaurant if I didn't feel like cooking dinner, and no one asked me why I was eating on the couch in front of the TV, no one dictated how I should live. My daily routine was simple, but there was harmony in this simplicity. Work during the week, rare but warm meetings with friends on weekends, lazy evenings with TV series and books, shopping when I felt like it, and morning jogs in the park on Sundays. For the first time in many years, my life seemed stable. I didn't feel the constant stress of money that I had in my youth, when every week could bring a new crisis and a new disaster. I could actually plan for the future, rather than just survive paycheck to paycheck, and my savings account was proof of that. With every deposit I made, I felt like I was getting closer to something real, to my own goal. Then my mom called. It was a Tuesday night, and I remember it well because I was watching a cooking show and wondering if I should cook something complicated or just make do with scrambled eggs. When I saw her name on the phone, something inside me sank, not because I didn't want to talk to her, far from it, but because she usually called on weekends, and a call in the middle of the week seemed unnatural. "Paula, honey, we need to talk," she said as soon as I answered, and there was something strange and strained in her voice, as if she was trying so hard to hold on, but the emotions were still pouring out. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked, simultaneously pressing the pause button on the remote to turn off the TV. "Can you come over tonight? Your father and I have something important to discuss." I realized that asking questions over the phone wouldn't get me anywhere. Her voice was already starting to tremble treacherously, as if she was about to cry, so I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and headed toward the suburban area where I had spent my childhood, where our old, solid, unremarkable, but cozy house stood, with a small garden, a porch, and the smell of cinnamon that always wafted inside when my mother baked pies. The drive took a little over 20 minutes, and the whole time I was trying to calm myself down, to convince myself that it wasn't that serious, that maybe it was something mundane, like a broken stove or a leak in the basement. But when I walked into the house and saw my parents sitting at the kitchen table, both silent, their eyes dull, their hands folded on the table, it became clear to me that it was something much more serious. My mother's eyes were red and puffy, and my father, always collected and strong, seemed somehow lost and older, as if his life had managed to crack since the last time we saw each other. There were crumpled napkins lying on the table, and 2 empty coffee mugs next to them, as if they had been waiting for me for a long time, unable to bring themselves to start a conversation without me present. "Sit down, honey," my mother said quietly, pointing to the chair opposite them. I sat down, my heart pounding. "Okay, what's going on?" "You're scaring me." Dad cleared his throat, avoided my gaze, and spoke. "I'm being fired from my job." The words came out of the blue. I couldn't believe it. My father, a man who had worked at the same manufacturing plant his entire life, punctual, hardworking, reliable to the point of grinding teeth. How was this possible? What? When? Why? I stuttered, unable to find the right words. "At the end of next month," he answered quietly. "They're closing our department. They're moving everything overseas, cheaper, they say. 47 people are out of work." Mom silently placed her hand on his palm and squeezed it tightly, as if trying to keep him from falling into the abyss of despair. "That's not all, dear," Mom said, and her voice became almost a whisper, as if each subsequent phrase required incredible effort from her, as if these words were heavy stones that she carried inside herself for too long, hiding from others, including me, so as not to cause unnecessary pain. And I looked at her, afraid of what would happen next, because her intonation changed, became the one that people have who know that they are going to say something that will forever change the atmosphere in the room, even if the sun is shining outside the window and something cheerful and carefree is on TV. "I've been having some health problems," she went on, and I felt my insides clench, like my heart had sunk somewhere and wouldn't come back up, because I wasn't ready to hear any of that, not that night, not after the news that my father had been fired, not when I was trying to keep myself afloat somehow. The pain in my back has gotten worse, and the doctor said I need to cut back on my hours. I can't work full shifts at the restaurant anymore. Some days I can barely stand for more than a few hours, she said, and as she spoke, I felt like the walls of the room were closing in on me, like all the air had been sucked out of the kitchen, and only the dim light above the dining table continued to shine indifferently on our faces. It felt like the room was spinning, even though I was sitting perfectly still, like I was suddenly on a carousel that was racing in a circle, and I didn't know where the brakes were. Both my parents losing their income at the same time wasn't just a bad situation, it was a disaster, and my thoughts were racing like startled birds. What about unemployment? "Can't the doctor help with your back?" I asked, hoping to grab onto something. Dad shook his head, a silent despair in his gesture. "Unemployment won't cover everything. And your mother has been going to the doctor for months. They say she needs surgery, but even with insurance, we can't afford it right now," he said, his voice even and tired, like a man who has done the math and knows the odds are stacked against him. "We're already behind on our mortgage payments," Mom added, her voice breaking as if each word was forced through clenched teeth. 2 months behind. "If we don't catch up soon, we could lose the house. The house I grew up in, the house where my childhood drawings still hung on the walls, where my old books still stood in the closet, where every creak of the floorboard was familiar from childhood. The house they had been paying for 15 years. The thought of them losing it made me physically ill, as if someone had squeezed my ribcage and did not want to let go. "How much do you need?" I asked, although inside I already knew that I did not want to hear the answer, because the instinct for self-preservation whispered, "Run," but my conscience was already sitting next to me and looking into my eyes. $1,800 a month just for the mortgage," Dad said, and his words hit me like a rock. "Plus utilities, groceries, Mom's medical bills," he continued, and I tried not to show the panic starting inside me. $1,800. It was more than half my monthly salary, and I had my own rent, bills, groceries, transportation, incidentals. None of it was going away. But looking at their faces, at my parents who had worked their whole lives for me, sacrificed, saved, denied themselves everything so that I could have an education, support, a roof over my head, I couldn't say no. "Okay," I heard myself say, as if it belonged to someone else, as if I already knew this decision would be the starting point. "I'll help with the mortgage. Just temporarily, until Dad finds another job and Mom gets better." The relief on their faces was instantaneous, and in that moment I felt my throat tighten as I suddenly wanted to cry, but I didn't allow it. Mom started crying again, but they were happy tears. Dad stood up and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Thank you, baby," he whispered, and there was genuine love and tenderness and desperate hope in his voice. "We'll pay you back as soon as we get back on our feet." I nodded, but inside I was already crunching the numbers. $1,800 for the mortgage, plus my rent, plus all my other expenses. That meant my savings account wasn't going to grow. In fact, I'd probably have to dip into it just to make ends meet. But they were my parents. Family helps family, right? That's what I told myself as I wrote them a check for the down payment on their mortgage that night, feeling a hollow, foreboding feeling creeping up inside me. The first few months of helping my parents were brutal, not in the sense that I felt sorry for them, but in the sense that the reality was much harder than I'd imagined. What started out as a simple $1,800 mortgage payment quickly turned into a money pit. Their water heater broke, then their refrigerator started acting up, then their roof leaked during a spring storm, and each new incident became my headache, my responsibility. Every few weeks there was another emergency, and a new expense would fall on my shoulders, as if the universe was testing the strength of my loyalty. Dad had luckily finally found a job as a security guard at a local grocery store, but it was minimum wage for nights, a pittance compared to what he was making at the factory where he was a skilled, respected professional. Mom continued to suffer from back pain, and she could barely work half a shift at the restaurant. Sometimes she would come home crying in pain, and I wanted to scream because I couldn't stand to watch it anymore and I couldn't do anything about it. After 4 months of this, I was drowning, not in water, but in debt, in fatigue, in the feeling that my own self was disappearing. I had already spent over $10,000 of my savings, and was using what was left just to cover rent and basic expenses. It was obvious that I couldn't continue living in my apartment and supporting them at the same time. When my parents suggested that I move back home temporarily to save on rent, I knew I had no choice. Just temporarily, my mother had said, until we get back on our feet. So here I was, at 28, moving back into my childhood bedroom like some kind of loser, surrounded by posters of my teen idols and bookshelves that no longer reflected my interests. I kept telling myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until things got better. My parents were actually very grateful for the whole arrangement. My mother cooked dinner every night, and I have to admit, it was nice to come home from work and not have to worry about what to eat. For about 2 months we had what you might call a decent daily routine, in which every minute was accounted for, every need carefully balanced, and every purchase thought out to the last detail so as not to go beyond the budget, which, despite all efforts, remained fragile, like a house of cards in the wind. And yet, despite this, we held on. I completely supported the family financially, covering all expenses, from the mortgage to the occasional breakdown. Dad continued to work as a security guard at night, and Mom did what she could in the restaurant, moving between shifts, leaning on a back that increasingly refused to obey her. And although all this was far from ideal, it was still manageable, at least so it seemed to me then, because at least I no longer spent money on renting my own apartment. One day, on one of those dull weekday evenings when you just want to get to your corner and melt into it without making a sound, I came home from work and immediately noticed that the atmosphere in the house had changed, subtly but noticeably. Suitcases were standing in the living room, neatly lined up, as if waiting for the order to leave, and this sight pierced my consciousness like a premonition of an approaching storm. My older brother David was sitting on the couch with his wife Sarah and their 3-year-old son Mateo, completely oblivious to the gravity of the moment, ran around the room squealing, knocking over furniture and kicking up papers like a small hurricane. I had not seen them for several months, because they lived about 2 hours away in another city, and their sudden appearance was unexpected and therefore alarming. David looked uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze, rubbing his neck as he always did when he felt awkward. Sarah sat with her arms crossed, irritated, as if I had disturbed their peace and not the other way around. "What's going on?" I asked, looking at all this luggage that screamed one thing: they weren't just visiting. David paused, and then, without looking me in the eye, said, "I got fired last week. We couldn't pay the rent, so we're going to stay here for a while until I find something else." His words hung in the air like drops of thick syrup that stretched on forever, and in that pause I saw my parents literally glowing with joy, because having a grandson in the house was not a burden for them, but a holiday, and without wasting a second, they immediately asked me to move into the smaller guest room so that David's family could have my large bedroom, because, as my mother explained, having a baby meant that they needed more space than I, the person paying all the bills. Life quickly became chaotic. Mateo cried constantly, especially at night. His sleep was restless, with sobs, screams, sometimes real hysterics, and the walls in our house were thin. Every movement, every sound became common property, and I slept maybe 4 hours a night, waking up broken, tired to the bone, and still dragging myself to work in the morning, feeling less like a person than an empty shell. David spent his days looking for work, or so he said, while Sarah complained about everything: the cramped quarters, the boring neighborhood, the lack of hot water because 7 people now shared a shower, and as she put it, it was just impossible. Meanwhile, I began to receive more and more requests for money, because there were now 7 people living in the house instead of 4, and the needs had grown exponentially. One morning, my mother said to me, 7 people is no longer a joke. The food budget is becoming limited. I simply nodded at the time, but later that night, lying in my new little room, surrounded by boxes and old furniture, I took out a pen and paper, started counting, and realized that my entire monthly salary was going to support the family. Every penny. My dreams of buying a house, the ones that had warmed me on the hardest days, died completely at that very moment. I still had my 50,000 savings, which I tried desperately to hold on to, like an anchor, like a last resort, but everything else, my salary, my bonuses, everything, was disappearing every month, dissolving into bills and food and medicine. David eventually found a part-time job in a warehouse somewhere, but he only worked in the mornings, and although he claimed to use the afternoons to look for something better, in reality he and Sarah spent most of that time visiting friends or wandering around the mall, leaving Mateo in the care of my parents. Then I started to notice Sarah's shopping habits. She would come home with expensive bags, new clothes, jewelry, designer items that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. When I asked her about it, she immediately became defensive. "Where did you get the money for that bag?" I asked her one day when she returned with another purchase, and she didn't even bother to come up with an excuse. "It's none of your business," she snapped. "I don't have to explain my purchases to you." I remember how everything inside me boiled. Later, in the kitchen, when Mom and I were alone, I asked quietly, "Tell me honestly, how much does David contribute to the household expenses? How much does he give you for rent, food, electricity?" Mom looked away, shifted uncomfortably, and finally said, "Well, he can't contribute now. His job doesn't bring in much money, and they have their own expenses." So let me clarify a situation that was becoming more and more like a comedy of the absurd. I was working full-time, paying the mortgage, utilities, groceries, medicine, and everything our little army demanded, supporting 7 people, including David's family, while his wife, without working a day, easily spent his salary on luxuries. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, because something in this picture screamed about injustice, about how the line between duty and naivety had long been erased, and I, it seemed, was the only one who did not notice it. One night at dinner, the very night when the noise and chaos seemed to have reached its climax, when I heard Mateo knocking over a vase with a toy for the 100th time and Sarah wiping the floor with a sour expression, grumbling about how difficult it was to live in such a cramped and outdated house, I finally couldn't stand it and, putting my fork down on my plate, said in a controlled but clear tone, "David, don't you think you should contribute something to the family budget?" I tried to speak calmly, almost matter-of-factly, as if I were discussing not a family crisis but another work presentation, but inside I was seething. We all live together, and Sarah buys expensive things, and I pay for everyone's food. Doesn't it make sense that you would at least partially contribute to the general expenses? The second I mentioned that perhaps David should start contributing instead of letting his wife spend it all on designer handbags, all hell broke loose. Not a storm, but a hurricane, a tornado of emotions, grievances, and indignation that I had never counted on. David exploded instantly, jumped up from his chair as if I had encroached on something sacred, and shouted, "You need to mind your own business, Paula. What I do with my money is none of your business." His face was purple, his voice was breaking, he was genuinely angry, and I couldn't figure out whether it was more from shame or from the fact that I had violated the fragile comfort of their parasitic lifestyle. Sarah, of course, nodded in agreement, pursing her lips, and added with icy calm, "She's just greedy and obsessed with money. Everything revolves around dollars and cents for her." And then, feigning hurt, David added, "I'm the only one who brings money into this house." I snapped, "Of course I care where it goes. Because it comes out of my wallet." I waited for at least my parents to intercede, to try to defuse the situation, or perhaps to side with common sense, but instead they, my mom and dad, took their side. Mom, with a reproachful voice, said that I was ungrateful, that helping the family was not something to brag about, but my duty, and that I was too fixated on material things, as if worrying about the bills that I alone bear on my shoulders were a whim and not a harsh reality. "Let's all go get pizza and discuss this like adults," David suggested, getting up from the table and feigning a friendly look at the assembled group. Of course, by everyone, he meant everyone but me. My parents, David and Sarah, grabbed their coats and headed for the door, determined to spend the evening enjoying food and company as if everything in our home was fine and normal. They'd left Mateo with me because, apparently, a 3-year-old would ruin their pleasant, relaxing dinner conversation. So I was left alone in the house with a cranky toddler who wasn't even my child, while the rest of my family went out to eat on my dime and probably complained about how unreasonable I was being. I sat on the couch, watching Mateo throw his toys around, and felt a heavy, sinking feeling in my chest, like I was trapped in a trap of my own good intentions. I was, essentially, a human ATM that also happened to provide free babysitting. And somehow, I was the bad one, just for daring to ask about the money that was slipping through my fingers. The next few months were hell. David was still working part-time at the warehouse, but he never seemed to be truly looking for anything better. He and Sarah would go out, supposedly looking for work, but they would always come back with new bags that I could already estimate the price of just by the brand. Sarah would keep buying expensive designer clothes while I kept paying the mortgage, utilities, groceries, gas, insurance, even little things that the others in the house seemed to never think about. December came and I was completely exhausted, physically, mentally, financially. I was working full-time, and in the evenings I would come home to a house full of people who treated me like service, even though I was literally funding their entire existence. One Saturday morning, Mom knocked on my door and asked me softly, almost delicately, to come downstairs for a family gathering. I already knew it wasn't going to be good. When I arrived, everyone was already gathered in the living room, sitting on the couch as if they were waiting for a spectacle. "We were talking about plans for Christmas vacation," Mom said with a fake smile, trying to sound carefree, but it didn't work. I almost laughed, because what the hell kind of vacation? We could barely afford to keep the electricity on, and that was only because I paid my bills on time. "Here's what we wanted to discuss," Dad said, looking at me with an expression that was a strange combination of pleading and confidence. "We think the family should go on a real vacation this year. Hawaii would be perfect." I stared at him, not believing my ears. "Hawaii? Now?" Sarah leaned forward, glowing like a candle. "There are some great deals going on right now, and Mateo would love to see the ocean." I swallowed hard. "How much?" I asked, dreading the answer, already knowing it would be catastrophically ridiculous. "About 12 grand between us," my mother answered, as casually as if she were asking me about buying a box of cookies. "We know you have a savings account with 50 grand. 12 grand isn't that much compared to what you saved." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They actually wanted me to blow my savings on a house, money I'd saved for years, hoping, struggling, bit by bit, sweating my brow, on a family vacation to Hawaii. And in that moment, I felt something inside me crack, as if all the weight I'd been carrying around suddenly felt twice as heavy. "This money is for buying a house," I said slowly but clearly, feeling something uncontrollable boiling inside me, like a volcano, long suppressed and finally bursting to the surface. "This is not vacation money, not a whim, not an indulgence. This is my goal, my only guide in this life that is increasingly losing its shape." But Sarah, with her usual imperturbability, lifted her chin and said calmly, "But we are a family. Don't you think we deserve a break after this hard year?" "Hard year?" I asked again, unable to contain my mockery, and my voice trembled not from weakness, but from shock. You haven't worked a day since you moved here. You spend David's salary on designer handbags, while I, alone, pay for your food, water, electricity, a roof over your head." David's face turned red all the way to his ears, and he couldn't contain himself and exploded. "There she goes again. About money again." "Yes, money," I retorted. "Because, oddly enough, I'm the only one in this house who cares about it. I'm the only one who works, who pays the bills, who took all this on myself." To this, my mother, with her usual gentle reproach, said, "This is what family does, Paula. We are not asking you for another sacrifice, but for an investment in memories. Create good moments with us, isn't that more important?" "The answer is no," I said firmly, feeling how with each word my roots, which until recently had kept me in this family, were torn out, revealing emptiness. "I will not spend my money saved for the house on your vacation. Find a way to pay for it yourself." At that moment, there was silence. Not awkward, not meek, deafening. Everyone stared at me as if I had hit them. The only sound in the room was Mateo muttering to himself as he played with his cars, completely oblivious to the tension. "Think about it," Mom finally said, her expression looking like it belonged at a funeral. "Christmas is about family. Maybe you'll change your mind." "I won't," I answered, through clenched teeth. "I already spend every penny I earn on this family. My savings are all I have left, and I'm not going to touch them for a beach vacation." I stood up and went to my room, slamming the door behind me so hard that the old photo frame rattled in the wall. I could hear them downstairs, talking in low voices and then louder, clearly discussing how selfish and money-obsessed I was, as Sarah put it, while I sat on my bed and stared at the ceiling, peering into the cracks in the plaster as if hoping to see some way out, a way to disappear, to return to a life where I could at least think about myself. It was Saturday. Sunday passed in a heavy, sticky silence, broken only occasionally by passive-aggressive comments directed at me. My mother sighed when I passed by. Sarah complained loudly on the phone that some people just don't understand what it means to share. David stopped talking to me altogether. I thought it was all just a blip, that they would cool off, understand, go back to the routine of me being the ATM and them being me eternally dissatisfied users. Monday morning, I went to work as usual, exhausted but still holding on, hoping for at least a quiet evening. The day dragged on endlessly, like the last meters of a marathon, and I dreamed of going home, eating my mother's cooking, maybe sitting in front of the TV in silence, hiding from the world. Even if this life was far from my dreams, there were at least some small positives in it that I clung to with all my might. But when I pulled into the driveway and glanced at the porch, something seemed wrong. There were black plastic bags by the front door. At first I thought they were trash, put out for the morning pickup, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't trash. They were my things. My clothes, my books, my documents, my makeup, my shoes, all neatly tucked into the bags, as if my life was something dirty that needed to be gotten rid of. My heart started beating faster. I pulled out the key, tried to put it in the lock, but it wouldn't turn. They'd changed the locks. Trying not to shake, I knocked. "What the hell is going on?" "Open the door." For several minutes no one answered, and I was about to scream when the door slowly opened, but not all the way, held by a chain. My mother's face appeared in the narrow crack, and over her shoulder I saw my father, David, and Sarah. They stood there, silently looking at me, as if they were looking not at a loved one, but at an uninvited guest. "What is this?" I asked, pointing to the bags. "Why are my things outside?" My mother's voice was cold as ice. "We decided that you need to think about your behavior. You are selfish and ungrateful. You put money above family. You're kicking me out because I refuse to pay for your vacation." I tried to comprehend the scale of the absurdity. "We're giving you time to think it over," my father said behind my mother's back. "When you realize that family is most important and want to help us with the trip to Hawaii, then we can talk about your return." I looked at them, through this crack, through this absurd, grotesque reality in which, as it turned out, I had been immersed all this time, but only now, Standing on the porch of my own house with bags like a discarded object, did I fully realize it. These people whom I fed, clothed, warmed with my money, whom I pulled out of debt and illness, literally threw me out the door because I did not want to finance their dream vacation. Are you serious? I breathed out. Are you really throwing me out? Think about what's really important, my mother said, and these words sounded more reproachful than loving. We'll wait until you come to your senses. And then she slammed the door right in my face. I stood there for a minute, looking at my things, scattered in garbage bags, crumpled, bent, as if they really were nothing more than trash that should have been thrown to the side of life, and there was something so humiliating and yet so liberating about the image that it took me a moment to process what had just happened. My own parents, the people I trusted, the people I sacrificed for, the people I paid for a roof over my head, the water, the light, the food, the medicine, had locked me out of the house I'd grown up in because I wouldn't give them $12,000 for a vacation, and in that absurd, painful scene there was no shame on their part, only an endless sense of entitlement. At first I wanted to cry, not because I was hurt, but because it was the only way I could get out all the pent-up fatigue, all the disappointment, all the pain I'd carried inside for too long, pretending everything was okay. Then I wanted to knock on the door and scream at them, to say everything I thought, without mincing words, to give vent to the rage that had been building up inside me for months. But then something strange happened, almost mystical in nature. I began to smile. At first the corners of my lips barely twitched, then laughter rolled up from my chest, light, but with each breath it became louder and louder, until I began to laugh out loud, sincerely, relieved, like a person who had just been pulled out of a cramped box where there was not enough air. They thought they were punishing me, depriving me of something important by throwing me out the door, but in reality they had just done something I didn't have the courage to do. They had freed me from the shackles of guilt, from the burden of family obligations, from the eternal debt that was being imposed on me without my consent. I loaded all my things into the car, carefully placing the bags on the back seat, and drove to my friend Lisa, who had a spare room and who had repeatedly said that I could always stay with her if I suddenly needed to. When I walked into her hallway with these bags and began to haltingly explain what had happened, she only shook her head with an expression of such sincere sympathy that I had not seen for a long time. "Your family has gone crazy," she said, taking one of the bags and helping me carry it into the room. "But honestly, maybe this is the best thing that could have happened to you." That night, when I slept in Lisa's spare room, on a simple but cozy mattress under a soft blanket, without screaming, without accusations, without remorse, I felt better than I had in months. I was free, and this feeling was truly amazing, like a breath of fresh air after a long stay in a stuffy room. I spent the next few days at Lisa's, and it was like waking up from a nightmare. No one asked me for money, no one threw reproaches at me, no one complained about life, no one shouted at night, no one knocked on the door with another request for help. Lisa had a spacious house, with a welcoming kitchen and a large window through which light poured in the mornings, and she immediately made it clear that I could stay as long as necessary. But I did not want to be a burden. I did not want to find myself in a situation where someone sacrificed their comfort for me again. So I immediately began looking for an apartment. It was strange to be looking at rental ads again after so many months of living in my parents' house, but it was also exciting. Now that I didn't have 7 people to support, I could afford a decent place to live, and it opened up a whole new perspective. Within a few days, I found a nice studio apartment in a quiet, green area with shops, cozy cafes, and even a small park nearby. The rent was reasonable, and without thinking, I immediately put down a deposit. Moving in was the best feeling in a long time, not just liberation, but a real return to myself. My own space again, my own rules, my life. I could eat what I wanted, watch what I wanted, sleep when I wanted. No one could come and ask why I bought myself an ice cream. No one could make me feel guilty for having personal boundaries. For a whole week, my life was blissfully quiet. No calls, no messages, no requests, no accusations from my family. I began to think that maybe they would actually stick to their ultimatum and leave me alone until I, as they put it, came to my senses and returned with my checkbook and an apology. But illusions are fleeting. On Tuesday morning, as I was getting ready for work, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw my mother's name. My first instinct was to ignore the call, but curiosity got the better of me. "Paula, darling, it's time to pay the mortgage," she said, as if nothing had happened, her voice even, calm, as if the recent expulsion were just a forgotten scene from an old play. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean?" "The payment is due," my mother continued, "and we're expecting the usual amount." "Mom," I said, and my temper began to boil again. "You kicked me out. You changed the locks and threw my stuff out on the street in trash bags. What makes you think I'm going to continue paying your bills anyway?" There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her taking a breath, fighting back rising panic. "But we don't have the money for the mortgage," she said, a little quieter, with emphasis. "You know we can't do it without your help." "You should have thought of that," I said coldly, "before you decided to punish me for not wanting to pay for your vacation in Hawaii." "Paula, please," my voice became shrill, nervous. "Now is not the time to be petty. We could lose the house. Then maybe David should get a regular job," I suggested with venomous politeness. "Or Sarah could stop buying designer bags and contribute. You have options. You just don't want to use them." "But Christmas is coming," my mother said, and her voice became soft, manipulative, as if she were trying to talk to my soul. "Now is not the time for family squabbles. We should be together, sorting this out." "You're right," I said into the phone, with the calm determination that comes not with anger but with final clarity. "Now is not the time for fighting. So I'm not going to fight you. I'm just not going to pay your bills anymore." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for me to sense my mother collecting her thoughts, choosing her words, as if she were trying to rebuild the bridge she had just burned. "What if we all sit down and talk about this?" she suggested carefully, her voice hopeful but with a hint of manipulation. "You could come home and we could start over." "Of course not," I said firmly, leaving no room for interpretation. "I'm not going back and giving you another chance to ruin my life. You made your choice the moment you kicked me out." My mother was silent for a long moment, and I imagined her sitting in the kitchen, phone in hand, not believing that her usual scenario was no longer working. "You can't be serious," she whispered finally. "I'm completely serious. Goodbye, Mom." I disconnected the call and, without a second's hesitation, blocked her number. Then, in a fit of determination, I blocked my father, David, and Sarah. After that, I deleted them from all social media, never to see their messages, photos, or reminders of the life I had finally freed myself from. I was done with them. Completely and irrevocably. At first, they tried calling from other numbers, leaving voicemails, sending text messages that drowned in the same old, tired rhetoric, family obligations, love, morality, accusations of selfishness and coldness. I didn't read any of the messages. I deleted them immediately, not giving myself a chance to even touch the guilt. After a few weeks, the calls stopped. I think at some point they finally realized that I would not give in, would not succumb, would not return to the role they had imposed on me. It had been a few months since I moved, and in that time my life had changed beyond recognition, as if someone had peeled off a gray film. And, surprisingly, I liked it. I had started saving again, not just putting money aside for emergencies, but with a conscious purpose, happily watching the amount in the account grow, no longer disappearing into the bottomless family money pit. My savings account, for the first time in a year, was truly mine. Sometimes, through friends and distant relatives, I heard rumors. Mom and Dad had to take on additional jobs to cope with the payments. Dad now works 2 part-time jobs, and Mom, despite her back pain, took on more shifts at the restaurant. David finally found a permanent job, not because he wanted to, but because he no longer had a choice. Apparently they still complain about me, calling me selfish, ungrateful, cruel. But here's the thing, they're not starving, they're not homeless. They're coping. Because when they had to, they found a way, the same way that was always possible. It was just easier for them to use me as a fail-safe ATM before. My cousin once confided in me that my parents told everyone in the family that I abandoned them at their lowest point, that I betrayed them, made me out to be a villain, a cold careerist who traded family for money. Some of my relatives actually started writing to me, some condemningly, some sympathetically, but all with the same mantra: family is more important than money. And every time I'd reply, if you believe that, start paying my parents' mortgage yourself. That usually ended the conversation. The funny thing is, I'm not even angry anymore. In the beginning, I was seething with rage, at the way I was used, at the way I was treated like a resource rather than a person. But now I just feel relieved. Because despite all the pain, despite how it happened, they did me an incredible favor. By kicking me out, they set me free. They made me do something I wouldn't have had the courage to do on my own. I was too consumed with guilt, too buried in expectations and family debt to leave. But they left for me. Now I've started dating again, not to distract myself, but because I have room for another person again, room in my life that is mine again. I'm making plans for the future, looking at real estate websites, thinking about a house again, a house of my own, where no one will tell me how much I owe and why. My 50 grand is still sitting untouched, earning interest, and I add to it every month, step by step getting back to my dream. Sometimes I wonder if they will ever apologize. If they will admit they were wrong. But honestly, I'm not sure I even want them back in my life, even if they want to come back. Because they already showed me who they are when they thought they could control me through guilt, through pressure, through manipulation. And now I'm happy. And not just okay, not tolerable, but truly. I have my own place, my own money, my own decisions. No one can make me feel bad for having boundaries, for choosing myself. My parents taught me a very important lesson, but not the one they wanted. They taught me that sometimes the ones who claim to love you the most can be the ones who hurt you the most. And they taught me that I am much stronger than I thought. I don't need their approval, their validation, or their presence to be happy. I am doing just fine on my own. Leave a comment on what you think of this story and don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. See you soon.